So, over the last few months, I've been going through all of the X-Men movies that Fox made over the past 24 years. I've been doing this for my podcast, Enter the X-Verse. Last time was Enter the Snyderverse. I'm getting ahead of myself. And we just wrapped up, we just finished it with 2024's Deadpool and Wolverine, and just like I did for the Snyderverse or the DCEU, I figured I would go through and just have a little recap of everything and rank all of these movies in some sort of list, because I like doing lists. Now, these movies have some high highs and some low lows. It's definitely a mixed bag, but should be interesting to talk about. And just to clarify, we did include some other Fox Marvel properties that aren't explicitly X-Men movies, but they feel like a part of the same period. If they were in that montage at the end of Deadpool and Wolverine, then they're on the table. So no need to drag this out, let's just get started with number 19, which is, of course, Fantastic. Possibly one of the worst movies I've ever seen. How's the best way to describe this? Movie's boring as hell, is really the main issue with it. It's a movie where a bunch of scientists boringly work on boring science stuff, and they don't get superpowers until about, I want to say like 45 or 50 minutes into the movie, and there's not like a scene with all four of the main characters in a room until about an hour and 20 minutes into the movie, and this is like an hour and a half long movie. It's just a terribly paced movie, it's boring, the performances are not very good, including by actors who I think are really good, like Michael B. Jordan is really phoning it in this movie, and you can see the studio edits all over the place. Obviously, the wig was a big thing when the movie came out. I'd never seen this before. This was my first time watching this movie, and yeah, it's terrible. It's genuinely just a terrible, terrible studio movie. One of those things where this is always the joke about the Fantastic Four movies, that they make them just to keep the rights. That absolutely feels like what this is. It's we have no good ideas for what to do with the Fantastic Four, so we're just going to make something so that we can hold on to the rights and maybe we'll have a good idea later. Number 18 is the Ben Affleck Daredevil movie. I think this movie has gotten like a sort of cult following over the years, but having watched it for the first time a few months ago, no, it's pretty not good. Ben Affleck is a very weird choice for Daredevil, but the bigger issue is it's not a movie. It's like a slice of life episode of a soap opera where a bunch of stuff just sort of happens and there's not really an overarching plot. There's not like a character arc really. It feels like jumping into the middle of a week-on-week story where you don't really expect something major will happen. If something major happens, that's a nice surprise, but you're just watching these people live their life. And that's the structure of the movie. I think the one saving grace of this movie is Michael Clarke Duncan as Kingpin, because yes, he was a very weird pick for Kingpin in terms of like a classic casting, but he's doing something with it. He's being like really entertaining and charismatic in this role, which just makes it work. So he's always a delight to have on screen, but other than that, the movie is, again, just kind of boring. Like, it's not terrible, it's just boring. And in my book, boring is worse than being terrible. Number 17 is Elektra. That's right, I'm putting the Elektra movie higher than the Daredevil movie because, at the very least, this is a terrible, terrible movie, but it is at least a movie with like a plot that progresses forward, and that makes it significantly more watchable. But no, this movie is famously terrible in a way that people talk about how terrible this movie is, but I don't know how many people have actually watched it. That was certainly the boat I was in, but having watched it, yes, it is a terrible movie, but it's terrible in a kind of campy, fun way, which makes it more entertaining. Some really, really weird stuff happens in this movie. There's a man who has like tattoos that come alive with terrible early 2000s CGI. There's like a death witch who kisses you to death. Terrence Stamp, Chancellor Valorum, teaches Elektra how to do magic. It's just a bunch of weird stuff, but it's weird in a more entertaining way. Like, it's a badly put together movie, but I had more fun watching it as a bad movie. Number 16, finally getting onto the X-Men movies because it's X-Men Origins Wolverine. This is the first movie on the list where, and that's not true, this movie does have some redeeming qualities to it. I think Lee Schreiber as Sabretooth is very good. And Hugh Jackman as Wolverine, as Logan, he's always killing it. He's always great in this role, so it's hard to complain too much about a movie with him in it, but it's just not a very good movie. Obviously, all of the Deadpool stuff is a big meme because it's just a truly tremendously awful idea, but overall, the movie is too bloated. It's trying to do too much stuff. The whole point was to be this like focused origin story, and it just isn't that because there's like 16 million characters in it that don't need to be in it. The movie refuses to let Logan do anything wrong, which is weird because the movie wants to be this sort of guilt story, even though Logan has never done anything that bad and he's always been a good guy, which kind of it means that he doesn't really have an arc in the movie, which is annoying. And yeah, there's just a lot of contrived comic book nonsense in this movie, like a gun that you shoot Logan in the head, and for some reason Stryker knows that will erase his memory and not just kill him. I don't know. It's just a silly movie that is yeah. I don't know what to say about it. It's just a bad movie. It's bad in a fun way sometimes. Like, I do think that while the Deadpool stuff is truly tremendously awful, that makes it funny, because having Ryan Reynolds with his mouth sewn shut and shooting people with laser eyes is just such a stupid visual that you can't help but go, that's pretty funny. So, it's got that going for it at least. Number 15 is Xmen The Last Stand. This one is... some people think this is the worst movie, and there is good argument for that. I don't think it is, just because this movie is really two movies, and one of them is kind of interesting and one of them is terrible. The one that's kind of interesting is the Cure plotline, and the sort of metaphor behind that and how that all goes. That feels very in keeping with the other X-Men movies. And then the nonsense plot is the Phoenix plot, where Jean Grey just turns insanely evil for basically no reason, just because she goes mad with power, and you're like, okay, this is very entertaining to watch, I guess. But the movie is still carried by the really tremendous cast of these movies, like Patrick Stewart and Gandalf. What's his name? Oh my god. Why can't I not remember I'm so terrible with names. I was going to reach for my phone, but I'm recording on my phone, so I can't look it up on my phone. Ian McKellen. Oh my... How did I forget Ian McKellen? God, that's embarrassing. The two of them in these movies is still perfect, and every scene between the two of them is great. There isn't enough of it in this movie, but still good. Magneto as a character in this one is less good in general. He just sort of becomes a more generic evil bad guy man, which isn't as fun, but Ian McKellen's still doing the best with what he's given. But yeah, this movie is just, it's a very disappointing finale to this trilogy, because it's my worst kind of finale, which is we'll just kill everyone off. Cool, thanks. So by the end of this movie, it's only Logan and Storm who are left, I think, because Scott dies, Jean Grey dies, Professor X is dead, even though he comes back in his twin or something silly like that. It's just, it's a bad movie. Number 14 is X-Men Apocalypse. This movie is so long and so silly, and yeah, okay. So, the First Class movies, the first two, First Class and Days of Future Past, are much higher on this list, and following up with this is such a downgrade. Apocalypse, in this movie at least, is not a very imposing or good villain. He looks really silly, and he talks in these like big grandiose speeches about like the end of humanity and how we were born to enslavement and all this, and it's so tonally the opposite of what all the other X-Men movies are doing with their villains, which is so many of these movies, like the X-Men, they're obviously like an allegory for whatever minority group they are. In the comics, it's usually like African Americans. In these movies, I would say the allegory is more like LGBT stuff, but whatever. The villains are usually like humanity or like oppression and that sort of thing. There's always like a clear metaphor there that you can follow. And then with Apocalypse, he's like this ancient god from Egypt who doesn't have anything to do with anything, and it just feels off for this franchise. And I know that Apocalypse is traditionally an X-Men villain, but I just don't think he translates to this movie very well. And the movie's trying to do way too much stuff. It doesn't properly transition to the new generation like it wants to, so the characters like Scott and Jean Grey and Nightcrawler, they don't really get anything to do because we're still focused on the Charles Xavier or Eric Magneto stuff. There's all this stuff with Magneto. He started a new family and they get murdered in the most stupid scene ever, where his wife and daughter get murdered with a single loose arrow, and it's such a weird, like, almost comedy beat that this arrow kills both of them in a single shot. Like, how good is that arrow? My goodness. There's so much stuff in it that some of it just has to be good. Like, all of the Magneto stuff where he goes to his place of work where they ratted him out and he's going to murder them all. That's fun. I mean, it's not fun, but it's a good scene. And Michael Fassbender is always killing it in these movies. What else happens? Oh, Xavier doesn't just go bald. He loses his hair because of Apocalypse, which is so funny. There's all the weird stuff with Quicksilver and Mystique and family, and yeah, the movie's just trying to do way too much stuff. And this is the movie that shoves in a Weapon X scene for no goddamn reason as well. Yeah, this movie has just way too much stuff in it. Number 13 is The New Mutants. This movie it's mostly boring, but it's not quite as boring as some of the previous boring entries on the list. I think this movie has some interesting ideas and some interesting visuals and some good performances. It just doesn't all quite come together. I think if this movie was given more time in the oven, it could have been a better movie, but this was clearly a movie that by the time it came out, nobody cared about it anymore, and you can feel that. It feels like we're just putting this out because we have it, and we should. I think my co-host Nathan brought this up when we covered it. This movie, if it was made today, would be Batgirl for sure. It would just be like written off for tax purposes. It feels like that sort of movie. But I genuinely don't think it's terrible. I think it's okay, and you could salvage these characters into a better movie, because I think there's some strong characters in here. It's nothing to write home about, and I don't have much to say about it. Number 12 is X-Men Dark Phoenix. For some reason we did the Phoenix story again, and I think they did it slightly better this time, but it's still not great. The idea of these movies being period pieces is starting to make no sense at all. It doesn't make sense. This movie's set in the 90s and it's apparently been 30 years since First Class, even though the characters look basically the same. They kill off Mystique in a really stupid way. The movie is weirdly... The movie's trying to villainize Xavier, even though it doesn't want to commit to it fully, so it basically justifies him narratively in everything he does. Vuk, everyone's favourite villain, Vuk, and the shape-shifting aliens. They are pointless, totally worthless to the movie. I don't know why they chose to do aliens. It doesn't fit in any kind of metaphor or any kind of like villainous thing. It's just, we need some goons to fight. But this movie is, at the very least, very visually strong. It has a very clear style to it, which is different from the other movies, but in a way that I quite enjoyed. It's very... I don't know how to describe it other than saying this movie's very visual. This movie's very visual in a way that I like, but they don't commit to doing the costumes, which in 2019, what are you doing? Do the costumes, come on. And it's not the worst. It's a real middle-of-the-pack movie, in my opinion. It's definitely better than some of the other entries on this list. Why did I not... For some reason, I didn't number these on my list, and now I cannot remember the number of any of them, so I'm just going to fix that real quick so I stop making that mistake. Okay, there we go. Number 11 is Fantastic Four: Rise of the Silver Surfer. We're finally getting to movies that I actually like. Some people think these movies are bad, the original Fantastic Four movies. I quite like them. I think they're very cheesy, but I don't think cheesiness is an inherent problem in a superhero movie. And I would say that I think the two movies are basically exactly the same quality. In fact, I'll just reveal right now to save time that number 10 is Fantastic Four. They're basically the same. But I think they're fun. I think this cast is really strong, and the best parts of both of these movies are just the cast doing bits. There's lots of cast just doing bits for most of these movies, and that's fun. The actual plots of these movies are like, whatever, but it's fun to see these characters do silly stuff, and it makes it an enjoyable experience for me. The reason that I put this one slightly lower than the first movie is just because the bits are a bit less good. It's really all it is. I think the bits are stronger in the first movie. Number 9 is The Wolverine, maybe the most forgotten movie on this list. It just kind of slips by this one because I think it came out in the same year as The Avengers or something like that. It really just got buried under the radar. But I think this movie is just quite a solid, nice little action movie. Obviously, Hugh Jackman, always great. I think this movie strips him of his healing factor for most of it, which gives it a little bit more tension, because a lot of the time with Logan, it's like, what's the point? He can heal from any injury. He's never going to be in any danger. I don't care about the big robot suit Silver Samurai. I have no investment in that character, so sure, big robot suit, why not? I will say the biggest issue with this movie is that for half of the movie it turns into like a love story, and it's just not a very good one. There's no chemistry between Hugh Jackman and the lady, and it kind of drags the movie down for a while, but once we get back to doing superhero action stuff again, it's pretty good. And Logan has a decent arc in this movie about learning to overcome grief and that it's important to keep living and etc, which becomes really funny when you get to Days of Future Past, which is the movie that came out directly after this. But whatever, contained within this movie, I think it works. And Japan is cool, you know? What more is there to say about that? Japan is pretty cool. Number 8 is Deadpool and Wolverine. I think this is a very funny movie. I want to preface that right away. I think it's a very good comedy. I do not think that structurally as a movie it's really all that. I think when you start looking into the details of the plot and what you're supposed to take away from it, a lot of that doesn't really hold up. Like, Wade's character arc in this one about wanting to be valued doesn't really go anywhere. A lot of the movie is about like rescuing his family, even though they're barely in the movie. He broke up with Vanessa between movies for no real reason. It doesn't add anything to the movie, and it's ultimately a bit pointless. As like a Deadpool movie to round out this trilogy, I guess, it doesn't really feel very connected to the previous two movies. And obviously, because this Logan is basically a new character, it doesn't feel super connected, at least to me, to the previous Wolverines. This is just like a new guy. But you can overlook a lot of that stuff just if the jokes are funny, and the jokes are pretty funny, so it's hard to be too mad about any plot details not making much sense. And in terms of wrapping up this entire Fox X-Men era, I think it does as good a job as it can, considering how messy this entire enterprise has been, with multiple branching timelines and different movies of various quality levels and all that. It feels like if not like obviously they don't bring everyone back, but it feels like a fun farewell to this era of X-Men before we move into, I assume, MCU stuff at some point. Staying on topic, number 7 is Deadpool 2. This movie is Deadpool but more, and that's fine. Unlike Deadpool and Wolverine, this feels very connected to the first movie and a lot of its stuff. It feels like more Deadpool, and it's still funny. It's still a solid movie. Deadpool as a character doesn't always work for me, with like the jokes that really don't work for me are like the weirdly sexual and horny jokes that feel like they're for children. I don't find those jokes particularly funny, but all of I find like meta references and stuff like that more funny. So that's fine. I like all the I like all the Task Force X stuff. I like Domino, I like Cable. So I think this is a fun movie. I just don't think it's as quite cohesive as the first movie in terms of being a movie. It's hard to. I have a whole podcast where I talk about all of this stuff in much more detail. So if you want like my full views on any of these movies, you can do that. Here we're ranking, we're giving some overall vibes, okay? Because I don't want this video to be 6 hours long. And then, because apparently this just happened, number 6 is Deadpool 1. I think this is the best Deadpool movie. I think it's very, like, in terms of when it came out and what it's trying to do, it's such a wild swing of a movie, this R-rated weird movie where he looks at the camera and he cuts people's heads off and all this. It's become normalized now, but I don't think it can be overstated how insane this movie was when it first came out, and you have to kind of appreciate it for that. I think Ryan Reynolds was born to play this role. This is just the perfect role for Ryan Reynolds. He's just doing Ryan Reynolds stuff all over the place, and some people are kind of sick of that. I think Ryan Reynolds is funny, so it's fine. I'm happy to watch Ryan Reynolds vamp. I think this movie has the strongest arc for Deadpool as a character, kind of learning to accept loss and you know, move on from his what's the right word for this? Learn to accept his condition of his skin and face look real weird now, right? And the whole movie he's trying to fix it, and in the end you can't fix it and you just have to live with it, and that's okay, and people will still love you, and that's, you know, that's nice. The villains of this movie are, you know, whatever, but I like all this stuff. I love Colossus, and I love Negasonic Teenage Warhead. I think they're great additions. I wish they were in more of the other movies, but it is what it is. Yeah, I think this is just it's a solid comedy action movie. It's very good. It's the best of the Deadpool movies, by far. Not by far, but definitely it's the best one. Number 5 is Xmen, the original, the first one. This is maybe one of the most important superhero movies ever that really kickstarted the era of superhero dominance. I would say this and the original Spider-Man, but this is just a solid movie. Casting is great on all of, like, he just knocked out of the park with the casting. I don't mind the black leather costumes. I think for the era they work. I think you wouldn't do it now because we've accepted colourful superhero costumes by this point, but even black leather costumes, sure. For when I was growing up, that's what the X-Men looked like. They didn't look all colourful, so I'm kind of used to it, I guess. I think the conflict and the metaphors are really strong in this movie for mutants and what they are supposed to represent, and the fact that Magneto basically has a point, even though obviously he's trying to do wrong and you have to stop him, but there's a question there about how and where do you draw that line, and that's an interesting question to ask about that sort of thing. And yeah, Ian McKellen and Patrick Stewart are absolutely killing it in these roles, so watching them go back and forth is just really fun and entertaining. There's not too much to be said about this movie, it's just a very good movie. I guess the only justification for why it's not higher on the list is that there's better movies. Speaking of better movies, number 4 is going to be by far the most controversial placement on the list, because number 4 is Logan. Now, this is obviously a fantastic movie. I really like it. The only reason it's at number 4 is that I just personally like more sort of traditional superhero movies, and this is very much a sort of weirder, more artsy movie type movie, and it's good as that. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but personally I prefer to watch, like, if I'm gonna rewatch a movie, I'm more likely to rewatch one of the top 3 as opposed to this one. But Logan is great. The performances are so strong, the plot is great, it makes me cry. It's just a very, very good, well put together movie. I love the world it creates. I really like what it does with these characters. It's not so much, I mean, it is bleak, everyone's dead, right? But it's bleak, but there's still hope, and I appreciate that. And because it's like an Elseworld story, like, who cares, right? It's doing its own thing, and I respect it for that. Number 3 is X-Men First Class. This is just a very, very solid movie. Again, I feel like I've been saying that a lot. They recast everyone, it's a period piece, but it still totally works. I totally buy these as younger versions of the original cast. I think in some way the dynamic between the younger Charles and younger Xavier, younger Charles and younger Eric is even stronger, because it's most of this movie, and it's just watching them go back and forth and have these different discussions and different ideas of what mutants are supposed to do is just, it's really fun to watch, and to watch that unfold and see this friendship kind of devolve and how it happened and all this. I think the team that they built works for the movie. They could use a little bit more development, but it's not really the focus of the movie. The focus of the movie is the Professor X Magneto stuff, and that's all just phenomenal. So it's hard to find any faults in it, and it's just I really like the yellowed costumes that they get. I like that they committed to doing actually something colourful for once, and I just think this is a very cohesive, good movie. Number 2 is X2. Silly name, but fantastic movie. There's nothing to be said about X2 that can't already be said. The Nightcrawler action scene at the start is amazing. All of the cast are still doing great. There's more of the Charles Xavier, Charles Eric stuff. We get into some of the Weapon X stuff with Logan, and it's the best that it's been in any of these movies. Stryker is such a great villain for this movie. I love anything where the bad guys and the good guys have to team up to deal with a greater threat, which is what happens in this movie. It's a very solid, classic movie, and it speaks for itself. The problem with this is I watched this movie at this point like 5 months ago, so it's a little bit hazy in my brain, but yeah, it's good. It's very good. And that, of course, leaves number 1 as X-Men Days of Future Past. This movie is, conceptually, it seems like it shouldn't work, and that's what makes it so impressive, because it's a time travel movie, and those are immediately really risky, but it does such a good job of bridging the 2 time periods in this movie, where we have the future with all of the old cast, and then the past with all of the new cast, and having that bridge between them, you can see the connections and how this leads to that and where things went wrong. And the visuals are all really good. I like the Sentinels. I like that they're these big weird Slenderman things. I think that's a cool, creepy visual look to them. I like what they do with Mystique in this movie. I think that's an interesting place to take this character that works for me. I feel like I've been saying this for the last 6 movies, but all of the Professor X, Magneto stuff just really works in this movie. And actually the 3 leads, you've got Professor X, you've got Logan, and then you've got Magneto, and they all bounce off each other in really interesting and dynamic ways, which just make this movie just work super well. It's got a lot of great action in it, it's got a lot of important things to try and say about oppression and what you can do about it, and how revenge just isn't a helpful response, even though it feels like it should be, because it just doesn't work that way, and it's unfair, but you have to do what you gotta do. I don't know if I'm explaining that very well, but it's a good movie. It's a very entertaining movie, and it feels like the perfect culmination of all of these movies, even though we got like 6 or 7 more movies after this one, but it is what it is. I still think this is a very, very solid movie. And that about sums it up for the X-Men movies. And I'm very curious to see what the MCU does with all of these characters, because I think while these movies have been messy, they have cemented some of the cultural idea of a lot of these characters and what they look like and what they do, which isn't necessarily accurate to what they were like in the comics, but it's what people know these characters for now, which will be an interesting problem for them to unfold. It's been this sort of parallel franchise to everything else, this branch of Marvel that's never quite properly connected back in. So it was an interesting experience to go through all of them, and I'm glad I did it. So yeah, it's been fun. It's been good. And all that's left to say is thank you for watching, and a very special thank you to my wonderful patrons for your continued support. If you'd like to see your name up here or just support the things that I do, then please consider signing up, as well as a like, comment, share, subscribe, and ring the bell. If you want to see all of my takes on the DC movies, then you can find that one up here, or to listen to the podcast that I hinted at, you can click this playlist here to get access to every single episode, and show us some love over on that side, because it could use some love.